It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman here with Becky Edens, and we're going to tag team an interview about parenting with the Beatitudes with Jeannie Ewing. Thanks for being here, Jeannie.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning. So all these books about parenting, why is parenting so hard? It's like the one guarantee. Everybody has parents. You'd think that we would have this figured out by now and be experts on parenting. Why is this still a struggle?
Yeah, right. Well, because everybody's so different. I mean, I thought the same thing when I was pregnant with our first. I read all the books, like what to expect books and all the books that people gave me for my baby shower. And then once I had her, and then especially our second daughter, Sarah, who has a rare disease, I just threw all those things out the window because really you have to rely on God's grace. And I think that's why a book like this is important, because when we're talking about the Beatitudes as a framework for parenting, it's really about teaching our children virtues, and it's about modeling it in the home as well.
Yeah, so what do you think is the biggest flaw with secular parenting books?
Oh, well, secular anything, they don't ever consider the soul. So if you're looking at like modern psychology, modern medicine, they'll delve into all the details, all the latest research that has to do with our physiology, our emotional or mental health, and they completely neglect the soul unless it's some kind of nebulous, new agey, the spirit, right. And you can kind of empty yourself into meditation. So I think we have to remember that God is a personal God. He lives within us. Right? So we're approaching Pentecost. We have to remember the Holy Spirit and that He's given us as parents the gifts and the grace that we need to parent the children He's given us.
Yeah. So when we're talking about parenting with the Beatitudes, maybe it's been a while since CCD or religion class in third grade. Can you review what the Beatitudes are?
Well, yeah. We list them in the very beginning, the introduction. So it's from Matthew 5, verses 3 to 12. So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven.
So do you think that parenting with the Beatitudes is a better way than parenting with the commandments, or is it a both-and kind of thing?
Yes, I think it's a both and. My husband and I wrote this book together, but we wanted to explore the Beatitudes because of a couple of reasons. One is that when Jesus was doing his Sermon on the Mount and he was proclaiming the Beatitudes, he was basically saying we are going to be blessed for all these things that we kind of look at as negative.
Right.
So, being poor in spirit, mourning, being insulted and persecuted, we're kind of like, we're going to be blessed when those things happen. And in some translations, it could be happy are those instead of blessed are those. Just depends. So we wanted to explore that because we live with a lot of these in our own home as far as grief is concerned. And you know that I write mostly about grief. So it was kind of an easy way for us to kind of explore and share our own story and our own journey of how do you live this life of difficulty with joy and with gratitude and with strength and courage. So that's why we wanted to explore the Beatitudes in addition to the commandments.
Yeah. And so it seems like a different approach, in some ways more positive, commandments being do not, and the Beatitudes being do these things kind of a thing. But also just a completely different approach of, I think, a lot of humility in a lot of these things, and like the being poor, your whole first chapter just kind of breaking down this poor in spirit. Actually, do you mind just kind of explaining how being poor in spirit relates to parenting?
Yeah, sure. So, when we think of poverty, we think, it's a negative connotation, right? And we often maybe think about how religious take a vow of poverty. Well, obviously, us as lay people, when we're parents, we don't take that vow, but it's something that we can explore as a virtue. So Ben and I, first of all, we looked in each chapter at how did the Blessed Mother and how did St. Joseph live these Beatitudes. as part of the Holy Family.
Yeah.
And I think for the main part in this chapter, in Poor in Spirit, we wanted to talk about simplicity, because that's kind of a sub-virtue, you could say, of being poor in spirit.
Sure.
Being poor in spirit is basically about being empty of self and of extraneous things. So you get rid of the emotional, spiritual, digital clutter, physical clutter too, in your life. And it's about kind of doing this spiritual house cleaning within oneself and within the family. And so that's where we kind of focused this chapter, and we centered it around how we can do that interiorly as parents and teach our children to do it, but then also how can we get together as a family and start getting rid of stuff and living with less. Because when you have less to consider or think about or take care of, then you're freer for God to move and act in you.
I was just wondering, as you're just speaking about this, did you and your husband already kind of live this way? Or is it something that as you're exploring the Beatitudes, you realized this is something as a parent I can get on board with? Or, at what point did you realize the Beatitudes were one of the ways that you and your husband were wanting to parent?
Yeah, good question. So everything that I write, I'm living myself. It's almost like a living, breathing document, so to speak. So as I'm writing it, I always pray to the Holy Spirit before I write, before I sit down. And then as I write it, I find that I'm writing it for myself too. And so I would say some of these things were experiential parts of our life as parents, or they were maybe words of wisdom that we gleaned from raising a daughter with a rare disease. But very much the crux of it, the meat of the book, is what we are still incorporating into our family. We're not a perfect family. We're not a model family. We fight, we argue. We've got stress in our lives. But we try to go back and think of what are we lacking in as a family, or what are we missing, or what are we kind of weak in right now? And so what is God asking us in this season of our life to grow in? So that's where I would say that this book is what we are still living and incorporating into our life.
We're talking with Jeannie Ewing. The book is Parenting with the Beatitudes, 8 Holy Habits for Daily Living. Jeannie, you wrote this with your husband, Ben, and is this the first book that you've written together?
It is. Mm-hmm.
So why did you want his perspective in this parenting book?
Well, it was kind of inspired after I went to CMN 3 years ago. I came back with this idea. I talked about it with Ben quite a bit. And as we were talking, we both kind of agreed that parenting books are often read by moms and women. Uh-huh. And yet dads have a unique viewpoint also and experience. And Ben can be humorous, which I think a lot of dads appreciate, but he's also very vulnerable in this book. So he shares some things that were struggles for him when he was growing up, or things that happened to him in his childhood that he hopes that he can do differently as a dad, things that happened with his parents that he's hoping he can learn from. And I think that that's important because men are not necessarily given permission by society, whether it's spoken or unspoken, to be vulnerable, to say, hey, yeah, I struggle with this, or this is hard for me, or I'm not really sure how to relate to my daughters, so to speak. So we have 3 daughters. Mm-hmm. So as a dad, I think he's learned more how to be open and sensitive and receptive and compassionate because he has daughters. And so he's learning how to share that with other dads who might not really know where to start.
So was there anything that he wrote and you were reading his reflection and you're like, wow, I never thought of that perspective on this? Because you kind of give 2 different accounts and 2 different perspectives on each of these Beatitudes.
Yes, we do. Yes, there was a story. I can't remember what chapter it was in, but Ben wrote about when his grandfather died. So he was very, very close to his maternal grandfather. And when his grandpa died, his dad came in the kitchen. Ben was getting ready for school. He was like a sophomore in high school. And his dad basically just walked up to him and said, your grandpa died last night, and then walked away. And so Ben, in his 16-year-old self, was trying to wake up, getting ready for school. He was stunned, and he had neither parent to just be there with him and say, how are you doing? Do you want to talk about it? He just never felt like there was any, and then nobody mentioned it again. Yeah. So when he wrote about this, I knew that this had happened, but the way he explained it and the way he shared about what he's learned as a dad because of this experience I felt really beautiful. And I also learned, I was like, wow, I didn't know this about my own husband. So that's just an example I can give you of that vulnerability.
Well, and then one of the things you do is talk about how St. Mary and St. Joseph modeled this, which I imagine some of this was easier than others because there's a lot that we don't know, especially about St. Joseph. So what were some of the lessons that you were able to pull from the Holy Family?
Yeah, right, exactly. So a lot of what Ben wrote was like, well, St. Joseph never spoke a word, so I'm speculating a little bit here. But a lot of what I took from Mariologists, I had been reading like St. Alphonsus Liguori, and I'm pretty familiar with St. Louis de Montfort. So when I was meditating or thinking about the Blessed Mother and her life and her character, it wasn't as difficult for me to think about how she lived these. I mean, for instance, I'm just going to take one random. So, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. I think meekness is probably one of my favorite Beatitudes because when I was growing up, everybody always taught us in religion class that meekness was humility. They were synonymous. But what I've learned is that there is more to meekness than just humility. That is part of it, but being meek is also about the softening of the heart. So, we think about how we live in this world where a lot of us have very hardened hearts because we've been hurt, we've been wounded, and what happens? We're not really capable of giving and receiving love in the form that the Lord wants us to. Because when our hearts are hardened, they're calloused, and He can't penetrate them with His grace. So the Blessed Mother, in her meekness, which people think is weakness, she's really exhibiting this courage, this strength, because she's demonstrating to us this radical trust and confidence in God's love, in His mercy, the fact that He will fulfill His promise. And she lives this, obviously, from the moment that we hear about the Annunciation and to the moment that Mariologists talk about her death and however that may have happened, and then the Assumption into heaven. So meekness is something that we can learn to be receptive, sensitive, open. It's a very healing beatitude. And I feel like the Blessed Mother is a very healing figure, a very powerful figure of healing for us as parents.
I think too, going into the examples of Our Lady and St. Joseph, I love that you had an action plan looking at Blessed are the Meek. I'm looking at the book right now, and I have a toddler at home, and sharing is hard for him. It's a hard concept, and you were talking about just teaching them to share out of a sense of generosity. I think this action plan piece in your book would really help parents give tangible things that they can do. So I think that's a piece that oftentimes when I read parenting books, I didn't get a lot of, so do this or try this.
The practical.
The practical wasn't there. So I think that's something too as a takeaway for a lot of people looking at this book. It's the spiritual side, but also how does the spiritual go into teaching your children this, not just saying, okay, great, this is great, tell them these things, but it gives ways to show them. And I really appreciated that in your book as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have a background in school counseling, so I kind of had a little bit of experience educationally with like the younger kids and then middle school age and then high school. And I kind of thought about developmentally, how can we break this down so that no matter where your children are or where your family is in terms of like ages, how can we incorporate this as a family? How can we teach these and model them to our children? So even like teens, I guess teens are kind of easier if you think of them as being more cognizant of justice and social justice and things like that than toddlers. But I had a radio interview the other day, and they said, well, is it ever too young to start teaching your children these Beatitudes? And I thought, no, that was my answer. Because, if you think about from the time that they're baptized, when we become adopted sons and daughters of God, we have that grace in our soul. Yeah. And God works through that. And so if we start telling stories about Jesus and reading the Bible or showing them pictures about the Blessed Mother and the saints, they will absorb that information.
Yeah, and we start by modeling it too. So check out the book. It's Parenting with the Beatitudes, 8 Holy Habits for Daily Living, JeannieEwing.com, and anywhere you buy books. Thank you, Jeannie. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kyle.